Hello and welcome to India Speak, the podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I am Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at CPR. This is the first episode of our series featuring leading experts and academics on the many facets of Sino-India relations. Some of them will be looking at the military side of things, while others will focus on the political facets. But today we will be discussing the historical aspects, looking at China and its relationship with India through a historical lens. And to do that, our guest today is a historian of modern China with research and teaching interests in social and economic history, history of science and statecraft, transnational history, and China-India history. Professor Arunabh Ghosh is the Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at Harvard University. His first book, Making It Count, Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China, came out in 2020. It investigates how the early People's Republic of China state built statistical capacity to know the nation through numbers. He has conducted research for the book in Beijing, Guangzhou, New Delhi, and Kolkata. Arunabh, welcome to India Speak.
Great. Thank you so much, Sushant, for having me. And it's a real honor to be the first in this new series that CPR is organizing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Arunabh, let me begin with your book first, because you mentioned a collaboration between India and China on the statistical front that is hard to imagine today. It involves PC Mahalanobis of the ISI. Can you tell our listeners as to what this collaboration was about, and how did you discover that interesting nugget? Were there other collaborations also around the same time that we don't know of?
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is always an intriguing sort of thing, because it was very surprising for me too, actually, because as you just mentioned in your very generous introduction, the book that I've written is primarily about statistics in 1950s China. I did not really expect to encounter such a strong India connection, and an India connection that would help me understand crucial aspects of statistics and statistical work in 1950s China. So maybe first I'll give you a sense of how I chanced upon this, and it really was quite a serendipitous kind of discovery. I think it was while I was browsing issues of the People's Daily that I encountered a photograph that showed Mahalanobis with the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, and a bunch of other people. And then the small caption read, Zhou Enlai hosts Mahalanobis for dinner. And this completely blew me away. This was 1957, July of 1957. I had no expectation of something like this being possible. So then I started digging and eventually discovered that this was actually part of a much more sustained series of exchanges that involved statistics. But why statistics? So what's interesting here is that on the Indian side, which I think a lot of our listeners would be familiar with, the Indian Statistical Institute and PC Mahalanobis as its director are central to this early phase of Indian history in terms of planning, in terms of placing statistics at the heart of planning. And what Mahalanobis was famous for, not just in India, but globally, was the adoption and expansion of large-scale randomized sample survey. This was a relatively new technology at that time. And on the Chinese side, what's interesting is that after 1949, the Chinese had explicitly rejected any kind of statistical activity that relied on probabilistic methods, including large-scale random sampling. So what happened was, over the first, say, 5 to 8 years of the People's Republic of China, from 1949 to about 56, 57, they relied on other means. And by this, I mean primarily on exhaustive enumeration, on attempts to essentially count everything to the final instance of its existence, the census method, if you will. And this, as you can imagine, led to tremendous problems, especially in the agricultural sector. So it was this chance meeting in 56 when Zhou Enlai actually visits, as I discovered. Zhou Enlai visits India, and he comes to the Indian Statistical Institute and is kind of blown away by the work that he sees being done, and then invites Mahalanobis to come to China. And this is a short episode where there is a real desire on the part of the Chinese statisticians to learn more about large-scale random sampling, because they feel this might allow them to overcome the kinds of problems that they are encountering because of this overt reliance on essentially the census method of counting everything exhaustively. So that's sort of in a nutshell what happened. And I trace this exchange from about, it's really intense, from about 56 to 59, with a lot of people going back and forth and things like that. But to the other part of your question, this is not the only instance really of these kinds of exchanges. I think they were happening in other domains. I have recently published an article about who I think is the first Chinese scientist to get a PhD from an Indian university, from Lucknow University. He was a student of Birbal Sahni's. But I'm collaborating with a range of other scholars, in particular by mining archival materials that were thus far not easily available, including actually the recently declassified Nehru papers at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And our hope is really to rediscover the actual breadth of exchanges that were going on in the 50s beyond the the sort of narrative of Hindi chini bhai bhai and sort of the cultural diplomatic kind of exchanges, but much more substantive exchanges that were going on. So I think there is actually a lot more to discover, and what I found are essentially crumbs that should lead us to explore more.
So were these exchanges, Arunabh, were they facilitated by the state? Were they driven by the state, both the Chinese state and the Indian state? Or were these exchanges like the science one you referred to, that were happening primarily through Cambridge and Europe, because Birbal Sahni was such a major prominent scientist in Asia at that point in time, and the Chinese wanted to collaborate with him? So were they driven by individuals, or were they driven by state, or were they driven by some other mechanics or some other processes?
Right. So I think you find instances of both. There is certainly a very strong state element in many of these exchanges. Some of these, because of the sort of larger geopolitics of the moment, sort of the emergence of a certain kind of third world politics, or global South solidarity. I'm using these terms slightly ahistorically. Global South wasn't used in the 1950s, but this post-colonial moment, if you will. So there is a lot of state interest and an attempt to bring people from both China and India as part of bringing people from different parts of the post-colonial world together. But I think you have a lot of instances where there are other mechanisms at play. So the one that I just mentioned, and that you also brought up about the scientists, the paleobotanists, that is about scientific networks, pre-existing scientific networks that then carry on into post 45, post 49, post 47 into the 1950s. But you also have interesting transnational political movements that are emerging that say have to do with, again, emerging Cold War politics, but also have to do with, I think, an attempt at an institutional level to engage. So the ways in which people are thinking of establishing transnational institutions like the UN, but for Asia, for instance. And here there is some state support, but not necessarily it's driven by the state. So this might be individuals who are conceiving of some kind of Asian association, say, for the advancement of a particular area of knowledge. And then maybe someone like Nehru will get on board, or Zhou Enlai will get on board, and so on. But the impetus is coming from elsewhere. So I think part of the goal has to be to recognize the multiplicities of possibilities, with a small footnote or asterisk to this, of course. This is more true on the Chinese side than on the Indian side, where, given the strong nature of the state in China by this time already, at some point it was necessary to get state approval, and that could be a harder process, and that may have led to greater state involvement as part of getting that approval. And on the Indian side, I think you see even more diversity.
Any of the examples of these associations which you refer to, which were like Pan-Asian associations?
So there were these very interesting discussions right after the establishment of the UN to set up under UNESCO and other organizations like that, to set up sort of scientific networks in Asia. So people like Joseph Needham and I'm blanking on a few of the other names who were involved. We're in conversation with people like, on the Indian side, for instance, with people like Homi Bhabha at TIFR, with Didi Kosambi, and then also with mathematicians at Tsinghua University, and also later on after 49 in Taiwan, about, say, establishing institutes of mathematical research. And again, the idea was not just, this could be not just mathematics in terms of, I guess, pure mathematics, but also in terms of how it applies to physics and research in the physical sciences and so on. So things like that, which were sprouts, if you will, that did not lead anywhere. Another is actually Mahalanobis himself wanted to set up an association, a statistics association for Asia and the Pacific. I think, I forget the exact acronym, something like that. So those are two that come to mind immediately.
Yeah, and I don't know, when does this kind of collaboration, this kind of cooperation end? Is it the 1962 war? Is it 1959 when the tensions, border tensions have started increasing? Or is it well before that? Something else happens before that?
So no, those are two hugely important moments. 59 March, when the Dalai Lama escapes, I think is a huge moment, at least from a state-to-state perspective, in terms of a cooling of enthusiasm. 62, of course, then becomes like a major wedge. But it's important to also recognize, I think, sort of internal dynamics to some of these things. So the 50s is a very interesting period in Chinese history. A lot of interesting upheavals that impact the intellectual world, the world of academia, in very specific ways. So intellectuals are targeted, for instance, in 1957 in the anti-rightist movement. So those things also, I think, have an impact on the possibilities for these kinds of exchanges. So one has to be mindful of the international sort of bilateral kinds of relations, but also then the domestic kinds of things that domestic developments that might impact sort of engagement.
Arunabh, there is something else you have written a lot about in the public domain, the inadequate scholarship on China and India. Can you give our listeners an overview of the kind of scholarship on China in modern times, leading to the contemporary era? And also, what are the reasons for this inadequacy in studying China and India? Why have we not done better?
Right. This is a great question. It's a very big question. Before I get into the China studies in India case, I should actually preface any response by saying there is a larger malaise in the Indian academy in terms of how we study and understand the rest of the world. So the China case is a very important case within a larger malaise where I think we lack expertise on pretty much including our neighbors, I think, including the immediate neighbors in the South Asian context, where we haven't devoted adequate resources over the past several decades. But in the Chinese case, what's interesting is that you see a period of intense actual interest in the first half of the 20th century, where a really important moment is the establishment of China Bhavan at Shantiniketan University, Tagore's university, that becomes the first research center dedicated to studying China, primarily at that time studying ancient Chinese history, so looking at sort of the expansion of Buddhism in China and looking at sort of questions of linguistic and cultural exchange, things like that. But what's important about that moment from a research perspective is that you have the establishment of the first dedicated China studies library in India. And I think for any good research to take place, the necessary, but insufficient, of course, but necessary condition is a good research library. So that kernel was established in the 1930s. And during this time, I think the other thing to remember about sort of Indian engagement with China is that there is actually a tremendous amount of interest at the popular level where people are traveling back and forth. And there are stories of people traveling to China, writing travelogues, often not in English. These are in different vernacular languages that you can find. And some of these have begun to be translated now. So there is this, there are several in Bengali have not been translated, but there are others, like I think there's essentially a memoir called Chin Mein Tera Mas, so 13 months in China, that was essentially a memoir of a British Indian army soldier who spent time in China serving basically during, I think if I remember correctly, during the Boxer Rebellion, and then he writes about it. So there was that kind of, I think, at a popular level, a certain kind of engagement. In terms of scholarship, I think you would expect that after 1947, after 1949, there would be a real investment. And there certainly was an attempt to bring about serious exchanges at a bilateral level. But you don't really see the kind of investment that you would expect, given that this is India's largest neighbor. And similarly for China, this is China's largest neighbor. You see the establishment of certain essentially, again, at China Bhavan and a few other places, an attempt to establish language programs in the 1950s, the attempt to begin bilateral exchanges of students and things like that. But 62 then becomes a huge, as I think many people recognize, becomes sort of a huge timing block. But the irony, in my opinion, is that instead of leading, therefore, to a greater sort of investment in studying and understanding China, even if it is from the narrow perspective of understanding why did we get what happened in 62 so wrong? Why did the leadership, why did the intelligentsia that was informing the sort of political elite that was informing the leadership, why did they get things so wrong? Instead of seeing greater engagement, greater desire to try and understand China, you saw sort of a retreat. So 62 becomes this moment, I think, where you see not investment, but disinvestment in China studies. And that has in some ways lingered into the present, I feel, where China studies remains a fairly niche kind of subject, a kind of discipline or kind of domain of knowledge to pursue. But that's at the meta level or at the macro level. There are other things at the institutional and micro level that I think are also very important to recognize. So one of the things, of course, I mentioned library. The other thing that's actually absolutely essential in studying China, of course, is mastery of the Chinese language. Well, mastery might be an extreme case, but at least a sufficient degree of competence to engage with scholars in China, to engage with people in China, to read materials in Chinese, and so on. And what has developed in India, and I think here it's the expansion of a model that we find in JNU, but then that seems to have spread to other institutions in India as sort of best practices, is a real separation of the School of Languages, where you have excellent teachers of Chinese and students who actually learn Chinese to a high degree of competence, and then places like SSS, the School of Social Sciences, and the School of International Studies that are then working on China substantively. You see a real divide here. So the people who do language don't engage in subject domain expertise, and vice versa. And this, I think, over the long run has led to a sort of, it has really debilitated this kind of area studies in India. So you have a range of China scholars now who are produced by JNU and a handful of other institutions that cannot engage at the level that you would expect with materials in Chinese, with scholars in China. And therefore, I think it sort of hamstrings our ability to then understand the complexity of a country as large and as diverse as China is.
Arunabh, I understand that the shadow of 1962 looms large, but after 1962, there is 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi goes and meets Deng Xiaoping. Then there is 2004 and the current century that we are in. By now, things should have changed, things should have improved. Why didn't anything change in these last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, I fully agree. Things should have changed dramatically, and why they haven't is a I mean, it's a bit of a mystery, but also not entirely, in the sense that I think a lot of this area studies impetus, unfortunately, we have enough historical instances of this, and the best example is the evolution of area studies in the US, often emerges from the recognition of the state that these are strategic areas that we need expertise in, and then the funneling in of resources. But what's interesting in the US case, and I think this would have had a salutary sort of effect if it had been pursued in India, is that yes, you create sort of a very narrow, strategically focused kind of expertise, but in supporting area studies broadly, you also provide grounds for a much wider engagement. So in the US, you see not only this sort of foreign policy and sort of contemporary China-focused academic community, but a much wider community that has expertise in China now. And something like that could have happened in India if there was concerted state support starting in after 88, as you said, or even more recently. Now that did not happen. I think this is a failure in many ways of leadership. I think it, again, I said, as I mentioned earlier, it speaks to a broader failure of higher education in India. I think the Chinese case is an example. China studies is an example of this. Another footnote to this, of course, is that there are interesting developments more recently now with private universities trying to sort of establish some kind of sort of presence in China studies. It's very early. It's not clear how successful they will be, but I think it represents a recognition, at least from, if not the state itself, then from society more broadly speaking, that we need to know more as a society. So, you know, there are private institutions that have set up centers for China studies that are trying to set up MA programs and things like that. But it's very early days still in that process.
Arunabh, you brought up, Western research and Western area studies model. You know, most Indian scholars use Western research and Western scholars to understand and study modern China. You know, we see this in the field of national security and diplomacy as well. To your mind, what are the dangers of doing this for Indian scholars and for Indian policymakers? This intermediation of knowledge through a Western prism. What are the dangers of this?
Yeah, I think this is hugely important, and it speaks very much to things that we were just discussing in terms of an ability to work with primary materials ourselves, an ability to form our own conclusions based on our reading, as opposed to reading essentially someone else's interpretation of events or documentary evidence. At a general level, I think the danger is that essentially in being secondhand consumers of knowledge and then formulating our own sort of interpretations, we are, I think, giving up in some ways a certain kind of agency in terms of formulating the questions and frameworks themselves. And which is not to say that, all of this sort of the existing work that emerges primarily in the Anglophone, but say the West, broadly speaking, on China is useless. Most of it's actually very, very interesting and very useful. But it is in some ways granting over our ability to ask our own questions. And I think asking those questions with particular contexts that are South Asia specific or India specific in mind. And these don't have to do with bilateral relations only. These have to do with the whole range of things that are going on in India right now, whether it's urban policy, whether it's health policy. I mean, Omicron and COVID is a great example, right? How do we think about policy in India vis-a-vis other places, including China? So I think if we formulate the questions, then the frameworks, then the way in which we look for evidence, all of that follows. So I think that so in some ways it's an originary kind of, what's the right way to phrase this, right? Like there's a kind of path dependence that emerges out of where you start. And so that is I think at a very broad methodological level the danger here. And more specifically, I think if you look at specific instances, then of course it is that you are essentially relying upon other sets of other strategic goals with which a particular, say, policy piece may have been written, and then you have to try and interpret that and make it applicable to, say, the Indian case, as might be what happens a lot. And that again is in some ways a needless exercise. You're not treating it as a data point, but as essentially largely informing your perspective altogether.
Would it be fair to say that even though India and China have been neighbors, they have been and remain distant in that sense? They've never been neighbors. They've been physical neighbors, but they've been not been neighbors in other senses. Is that true?
Yeah, so this is, I think, yes. The short answer is yes, but there is a footnote or a complicated answer that would be no. The yes is in terms of contemporary nation states, I think. The ways in which the Republic of India and the People's Republic of China see each other, there is very much. The Himalayas are not just a physical barrier, they're a barrier in other ways. But if you think in a slightly longer durée historical sense, then people from the subcontinent, both subcontinents, if you think of East Asia, China and India, subcontinental sort of spaces, have been meeting and intermingling in other parts of the world. So Southeast Asia is a great example of this. The Caribbean is another great example of this. And of course, much more recently, actually, the US is a great example of this, because you have roughly, I think, 5 million people of Indian descent in the US and roughly 5 million people of Chinese descent in the US. So there is actual engagement in other spheres. But from a contemporary nation state perspective, in China and in India, yes, you're totally right that there has been, I think, there's a real impasse in terms of bilateral engagement, understanding. So then that's why we fixate on these specific moments, like Amir Khan's amazing popularity in China, right? Becomes this thing to wonder at because it's so unusual, it's so exceptional.
And you sometimes wonder that China is India's biggest trading partner, and by a long distance, and you still don't have that,
absolutely,
that kind of neighborly relationship.
That's the other reality. And I mean, I think what is it? It's gone over $100 billion, the mutual trade now, right? So and in spite of all the political rhetoric of not buying Chinese products and so on, there are ways in which the Chinese and Indian economy are actually much more deeply interlinked than people realize. But again, at a popular concept, in terms of popular perceptions, there is a real divide.
Arunabh, as a historian, what is the biggest myth about China in India that you constantly face and maybe even get irritated about? And similarly, when you are in China, what is the biggest misconception or misunderstanding about India that gets your goat?
I don't know if I have a good answer about this, because this again perhaps speaks to some of the problems you are alluding to. I think in India, the thing that I find the most galling at times is the sheer ignorance about China. There really isn't much of a sense besides sort of a very sort of contemporary notion. And of course, more recently, there is that that it's this amazing success story and so on. It's not a myth, but it's the constant sort of raising China up onto a particular kind of pedestal by a certain set of Indian elite, I should say. If you go beyond that, there isn't even that much. There is no sense, I think, real acknowledgement of what India is. Oh, the other thing I should actually add, in terms of it's an irritating myth, of course, is this complaint about the quality of Chinese products, right? That you do hear a lot, which I think is also somewhat misplaced. But it itself, it would be interesting to research in terms of, we just talked about bilateral trade, about how much of this is, it's by design in terms of the ways in which commodities are flowing, in terms of the ways in which markets are understood, and where higher quality versus lower quality products are being sent. And of course, the role of intermediaries, the people who are actually importing stuff, which might be on the Indian side. Anyway, but that's an aside. So as I said, the bigger thing for me, though, is not so much a myth, but just the ignorance, just the sort of the very broad strokes generalizations that exist about China that can be a bit of an irritation. On the Chinese side, it's not so much ignorance as opposed to, well, there is sort of a romanticization. It's interesting in more recent terms. This is more recent in terms, mostly I think from in the past 2 decades, as the Chinese economy has taken off, and there's a certain kind of confidence amongst the Chinese middle class about their own place in the world and their own sort of economic growth. That India is now, it's in some ways an interesting kind of orientalization. India is the land of mystical wisdom, and the power of religion and morality and things like that. This is not a dominant strain, but you do hear it amongst. It's certainly it's certainly very distinct amongst a certain set of sort of, again, middle class elite Chinese. And this I find very interesting in terms of it's no longer even seen in comparative terms, but it's seen as this, again, you can, as I said, you can orientalize it and you can almost romanticize it. So this is the place you would need to visit if you are, you're in the throes of materialist sort of a crisis of materialism, and then India is the place that you could go in some ways as a, so this again happens, it certainly happens amongst elite, very, very rich Chinese, that, partly this is driven by sort of the, what you could call the tourism around surrounding Buddhism, right? So that you visit the various holy sites in South Asia, in India in particular, that are linked to Buddhism. And of course, in this, it's not just Chinese tourists, but also Japanese tourists and tourists from Southeast Asia. But there's this kind of search for a certain kind of moral or religious equanimity. So that's something that I find kind of both interesting and a little irritating, that it's that perception has devolved to that.
Yeah, and yoga as well. We've done a bit by putting yoga in the mix as well.
Yes, thank you. Yoga I feel is a global phenomenon. It's not restricted to the Chinese themselves.
China's economic success and rise as a global power has really created a sense of China envy in India, the one you alluded to in your answer. The secret of Chinese success is seen as its character as a centralized authoritarian state, unlike India's very raucous democracy. Is that a fair understanding of contemporary China in India, and if not, why not?
I think it's a fair understanding of what the understanding in India is, or a fair reflection of what the understanding in India is. But I think it's sort of, again, so this is, of course, this is the understanding at the level of sort of the elites and intelligentsia in India, right? I think not the popular perception. And so I guess this would be my answer to your question, if I was only looking at the elite response, would be this kind of sort of envy at, or the hankering for a strong centralized authoritarian state. So I think there isn't much wiggle room to say that yes, it's relatively authoritarian compared to other parts of the world. It's relatively centralized compared to other parts of the world. But I think it in some ways, framing it in this way begs the question, because one sort of looks at it today without acknowledging both the recent history, the history of the past 70 years since 1949, but also the longer durée history of the nature of the state and state-society relations in China. And the same thing is being done on the Indian side, right? So you're not acknowledging the longer durée history in India of states, a centralized state, the nature of state-society relations, and so on. But I think one important sort of test or question one should ask when we frame it this way is this, look at how successful China is, and it's because of its strong centralized authoritarian state. You have to then acknowledge by that same token that all the failures before the success should also be attributed to precisely the same thing, then the fact that it was a strong centralized authoritarian state. And these failures are not trivial. These failures are failures that led to arguably the largest famine in absolute terms in human history. This is the Great Leap Famine of the late 1950s. It led to tremendous turmoil in the decade that followed, attacking, essentially tearing society apart from the inside. So I think we have to recognize then that certain things come with a strong centralized authoritarian state. It can be very effective in certain areas, but the failures can also be cataclysmic. So that's one thing to remember. And then the other is to what extent, this is where the longer durée historical point becomes important. To what extent can a particular contemporary reality that has a larger sort of historical set of antecedents, how can you sort of apply that to a place like the Indian subcontinent, which is tremendously different? And a simple way to think about this is the way in which we understand the centrality of the state, or the presence of a large centralized state through the long durée history of the subcontinent. Right? In the Indian subcontinent, a large centralized state is the exception, not the rule. Whereas if you were to generalize, it's the opposite case in the Chinese case. It is a rule, and the exceptions are when there is disarray and being broken apart. So there is a very different sense altogether about how individuals think about the state. And I think until this is sort of acknowledged and taken up seriously, this kind of very superficial envy and like, oh, all we need is a strong state that can ride roughshod over, whether it's people's rights or other kinds of environmental regulations and so on. I think will have a certain kind of appeal, but is extremely dangerous.
And I also think that it comes out of a certain ignorance of China, because there is a certain amount of federalism in the Communist Party model as well. The provinces and the districts decide what they wish to do in terms of so many policies that they have at their levels, and the competition among these provinces and districts. And even if you look at some of the public health, public education things, that have also come about because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is hugely important, and this again speaks to, I think, sort of thinking of China as a sort of given unit and not recognizing actually that it's, demographically, well, still, but maybe not for very long, larger than India, but geographically significantly larger with a tremendous amount of variation. And then the way in which the provinces run. And there's a very good example from just, very recently, which is what happened in the city of Xi'an. And the massive lockdown that took place in Xi'an because of the cases of COVID that were discovered. And if you look at the internal chatter and the way in which people are understanding this within China, Xi'an has historically been seen as a relatively poorly run city compared to, say, Shanghai or Beijing or some of the other cities. And so people were not surprised that you saw mismanagement and all those cases about people being turned away from hospitals and so on because the lockdown was being imposed, but then that led to other kinds of hardship. These are people who are not, who are seeking help not because of COVID, but for other medical reasons. So there's this kind of internal recognition of diversity, variation, different ways in which different provinces have responded. I mean, one of the things you see, for instance, is the tremendous inequality right now within China, where the coastal provinces are significantly richer than the provinces I shouldn't say hinterland, but inland provinces. So again, that needs to be explained and understood. It can't be explained and understood with this sort of unitary, centralized, authoritarian state model. So yeah, that's very important.
I don't know, this border crisis that India and China face, which is the most contemporary issue when Indians think of China today, history plays a role in it. The colonial part, the imperial past. How important is the role of history in the kind of crisis that we see between India and China now?
So I think history is important. Probably at two levels. One is just as you just alluded, I think recognizing that a lot of these problems have their origins in sort of the imperial and colonial legacies that both the Republic of India and the People's Republic of China are dealing with, but I think more than just dealing with, recognizing that how, in some ways, enthusiastically both states, accepted these imperial legacies, right? So it's in particular the territorial sort of imaginaries and the realities in some ways of British India, of the Qing Empire. So I think recognizing this is the first step, and there is, I think, in both countries a very again amongst the elite and the intelligentsia, they're very quick to blame imperial and colonial legacies as when it comes to the other country, but are very slow to recognize the fact that similar logics are operating for them too. So at a meta-historical level, I think that's hugely important. But I think at a more micro level, in terms of the 20th century itself, I think historical scholarship is extremely important in understanding what exactly happened and sort of what, how to sort of complicate the easy and grand narratives that exist. So right now, for instance, in India, it's very popular to blame everything on Nehru. Earlier, it used to be Krishna Menon, now it's Nehru. But I think this does a disservice to actually understanding what were essentially a series of very complex moments and trying to understand why decisions were made the way they were and so on. So I think the first step would also be to sort of step away from the kind of blame game that becomes this is, of course, for popular consumption, this is what you want to do. It's easy to sort of play things off and sort of have people to blame. But from a historical scholarship perspective, I think this needs to happen on both sides. And here, the big challenge is access to archival materials, access to sort of getting a sense of the deliberations as they happen in those specific moments. There's been good work on the Indian side recently, as you, of course, I'm sure are also aware. Nirupama Menon Rao has just published a book, and there's a whole host of other books that have tried to explore the border crisis and its evolution. We have seen some work on the Chinese side also, but the archives on the Chinese side remain closed. So it's been difficult for scholars outside of the PRC to explore these questions from the PRC side in many ways.
Aruna, before I let you go, can you suggest 3 books about modern China that you would recommend to those interested in understanding the country better?
There's been so many good books published in the past 2-3 years that this is an extremely difficult task.
Pick as many as you wish.
So, if I can mention a few without restricting myself to 3, then I can touch upon a few different areas that might be of interest to readers. So one that emerges out of the conversation we've had about the nature of the state and the nature of the Chinese state in particular, I think a really interesting book would be Timothy Brooks' Great State, which tries to look at sort of the way in which we should understand the nature of the Chinese state through a longer durée perspective, not just 20th century. So Brooke is primarily a historian of the Ming, but then writes expansively. So that would be a great book to get sort of a slightly longer durée perspective on the history of the Chinese state itself. There's a good book on the history of the party that was just published by Tony Sage, my colleague at the Kennedy School here, called From Rebel to Ruler. And that gives you more of a sense of how the party, it's a pretty dramatic story because it's a party that was on the fringes in the early 1920s and by 1949 came to dominate the largest country in the world. And now the largest economy in the world, soon to be, or if by PPP terms already there. So that's another book that gives you a party history. There's if I'm allowed, a couple more or 3 more now that I'm thinking of it. There's a great book by the Chinese historian Yang Kuei-sung. I think it's called 8 Outcasts. It was recently translated into English. And this provides a very different perspective on post-49 Chinese history. It's from the bottom up, as the title suggests. It's the story of 8 people who had to undergo, because of their individual identities made them outliers or a certain kind of minority. It could be because of their sexuality, it could be because of other kinds of things, and how they endured the first 2-3 decades of the PRC. So 8 Outcasts by Yang Kuei-sung. I'm reading right now, after a long time, finally I've been meaning to, a memoir, and this might be of interest again to an Indian audience. It's a memoir by probably China's most famous Indologist, a man by the name of Ji Xianlin, who wrote a memoir called Cowshed, and it's his experience of the Cultural Revolution. He was a very prominent professor. He was at Peking University, the most prominent university in China, and endured all kinds of hardship during the Cultural Revolution, and he wrote about it. So that's again another fascinating take. Finally, one last book I can mention, which I think speaks to sort of the economic takeoff of China starting in the 1980s, but provides a sort of much more nuanced and perspective on what the kinds of decisions that were taken, is a book by the economist and economic historian Isabella Weber called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And this is sort of price controls and the ways in which price controls were imposed in the early 1980s as China was liberalizing. So a very interesting economic history that is in some ways quite important today also in trying to understand the dramatic growth of the Chinese economy. So I've obviously mentioned more than 3. I have many more to mention, but maybe I'll stop there. So
no, that's perfectly fine. Arunabh, thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful conversation. It was really nice. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.